The Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project is supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Canada has a dark history: institutional abuse, political exclusion, enfranchisement, lack of government accountability, and outright cultural genocide. For decades, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities have been asking for jurisdiction over their own family care. With Bill C-92, nations can finally make progress on this matter. Hello, and welcome to Inherent Rights Informed Voices, a podcast brought to you by the Center for First Nations Governance and the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. Today, we will have a brief discussion with special guests about governing structures involving First Nations children and family laws. Kansekia ni wokamaganak Nathan Oaks ni wihuin ayagasamuene. Niniheopwat egwanehel Niheopwatak Newotepahatamenaski Sawanaki Saskatchewan Utsinia. Hello, my relatives. I am called Nathan Oaks in the English language. I am of Neheopwat and Neheo descent, otherwise known as Assiniboine and Cree. I am from Paipot First Nation Treaty 4 territory, South Saskatchewan. It is my pleasure to be your host for today's session. I am currently a doctoral student in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. As a research assistant with the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project, I am absolutely thrilled to have an opportunity to learn from and collaborate with visionaries such as our special guests we have today. Having the opportunity to research the history of both First Nations traditional and Indian Acts governance structures gives me an opportunity to pursue healing my own understanding of these concepts. Importantly, being a part of this work gives me hope that I'm involved in work that contributes to community cultural healing, strengthening Indigenous research, and community knowledge revitalization. Overall, I am grateful to support the journey of First Nations communities exercising their inherent rights and collective self-determination. The enduring work of many First Nations scholars, lawyers, advocates, and community leaders challenging the Canadian government in courts led to the Canadian government finally passing Bill C-92 in 2019. After decades of fighting for the inherent right for First Nations to exercise authority and control over child and family services, we are now seeing change taking shape across the country in various ways. It is important to highlight that this is only the second instance the Canadian government has passed a law that supports the First Nations' inherent right to self-governance. Bill C-92 ensures a shift in control for First Nations across the country, providing an opportunity for communities to develop their own policies and, if they choose, laws that align with their own unique needs in family care. This shift in control ensures that nations aren't reliant on federal or provincial jurisdiction, which has had a history of abusing its responsibility to Indigenous child welfare by providing inequitable welfare services to Indigenous children. The bill was co-developed with Indigenous provincial and territorial partners. A critical component of the bill is to prioritize children's connection to family, community, and traditional customs and culture above else. Educating people about the Act is fundamentally important for both researchers and communities looking to support the implementation of this new law. It is also important to understand how the process of implementing Bill C-92 has taken place. Now, what does this look like across the 11 First Nations in Canada who have started the process? Our guests will briefly share unique perspectives on the importance of Bill C-92, identifying some work to date, and opportunities and challenges for how a First Nations governance structure plays a role for communities implementing the bill to suit their needs. He's the National Community Research Director at Rebuilding First Nations Governance, the Co-Executive Director at the Center for First Nations Governance, and now, after successfully defending his thesis on Indigenous executive turnover, a doctor, Dr. Mason Ducharme. His experience, both in academia and in the community involving Indigenous governance research, is exemplary and monumental. Dr. Ducharme co-authored the Rebuilding First Nations Governance briefing note on Bill C-92. In fact, I have had the honor to be a contributing co-author in another article, Implementing Bill C-92, Strengthening Indigenous Jurisdiction and Community Resilience in Child Welfare. In this work, Dr. Ducharme led the way in exploring emerging First Nations child and family laws across Canada. He strongly advocates the importance of looking at this work through a community-based lens for a deeper understanding of First Nations governing structures and effective self-governance practices. Good afternoon, Dr. Ducharme. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today. I'm very honored to be a part of this work with you. I was wondering if you could tell us a few things about your position in this paper.
Thank you, Nathan. It's nice to see you today. I'm doing well, and I'm happy to talk about this paper that you, Anna, and I co-wrote and submitted to the Canadian Public Administration Journal. So on that paper, I was the lead author, and this paper actually emerged off of a quick, I'd call it a briefing note that Julie Williams and I co-wrote for the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. And that briefing note emerged from a discussion with one of our community partners that had a question on what can a governing structure look like outside of the Indian Act, out of Section 9124 of the Constitution, and outside of Section 92 of the Constitution, which talks about the provincial jurisdiction, because oftentimes we'll find that Indigenous organizations tend to put themselves under the Indian Act or under their Provinces Societies Act. So after hearing Dr. Satsan talk about Bill C-92, I was like, that is an amazing opportunity to figure out how are communities placing these governing structures outside of either of those two areas and into Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution under our inherent right to self-government. So that's how this whole research paper emerged, and I'm happy to say that it's been really well received, where we've presented it at the Our Children, Our Way conference in Vancouver in November 2025. So I'm really excited to be here and talk about this, because I truly believe that is one of the avenues to exercising our inherent right to self-government comes from this Bill C-92 legislation, because it is one of the first pieces of legislation that recognize and affirm the inherent right to self-government. And most excitedly, when you read that legislation, there is zero mention of the Indian Act. There's zero mention of Chief and Council. It talks about an Indigenous governing body, and that could be placed under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. So the opportunities are tremendous. So that's why I'm excited to be here, and thank you for welcoming me, Nathan.
This position sounds very meaningful to you in this work. I can really appreciate that. It has been a long-endured struggle, indeed. So you've been studying the Bill C-92 and teaching people about it for a long time. Can you give us a rundown of what it is for those that might not be so familiar?
I must admit I'm not a legal expert, but I'll try to provide a Coles Notes version of it. And Bill C-92 is a legislation about an act respecting Indigenous children and families. And this act stems from the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples since colonization has occurred. You look at residential schools, you look at the 60 scoop, you look at, today's foster care system. There's lots of mistreatment that's there. So what happened with this one is Dr. Cindy Blackstock went to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and argued that Canada's and the provinces, or we'll just say the Crown's, mistreatment of Indigenous people was in fact discriminatory, as well as the funding practices. So as a result of that, and probably the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, we have this piece of legislation that was introduced, I believe, in January 2021. And it is one of the first pieces of legislation to recognize the inherent right to self-government and an Indigenous governing body. So essentially what this does is provides the jurisdiction of children and family back to First Nations, which is amazing given you look at the history of it all, where it's been either federal jurisdiction, provincial jurisdiction. Sometimes they argued on whose jurisdiction it was. But now we're getting some certainty where communities can create their own law and say that children and family are the jurisdiction of the First Nations communities or organizations. So it's really bringing us back to that inherent right to self-government. We sustained our children and families since time immemorial, and that was interrupted with colonization. So this is a really big win for our communities. It's a way to bring back our laws, our ways. It's a way to take care of our families again, to reclaim that jurisdiction that was taken from us.
It gives a very good example as to why this law is so groundbreaking. Thank you for sharing on that. So creating new laws, as we understand, can be a difficult process. What can nations do with the bill C-92 right now? So what are some of the downsides if a nation does not create its own law?
You're right to say that it is a challenge to create your own laws. It's time-consuming, it's expensive. But one thing that Satson and Albert like to share is there are things you could be doing within Bill C-92 right now without creating your own laws. And I think one of the most powerful things that can be implemented right now is this thing called the placement of the child. So the law clearly indicates the priority of the placement of the child if they're to be apprehended. And I don't have the list in front of me, but essentially what it really does is it advocates for keeping the child within the family and within the community. So within the family is usually top priority, and if you can't find anyone within the family, it's within the community. And if you can't find anyone within the community, it goes within the nation. So for example, I'm part of the Inuit Nation, but we're one of multiple communities that's part of St'át'imc Nation. So if we can't find anyone in the Inuit Nation, we look at those other communities that are part of the St'át'imc Nation. And if we can't find anyone in our own nation, we look at an Indigenous person outside of the nation. So they could be, for me, the Inuit Nation, closest one is Squamish Nation. Or it could be an Inuit person, or a Métis person. And then in the last event where you can't find any of those, that's when the non-Indigenous person is considered as kind of the last resort. So my understanding for that is that's a way to make sure and protect the child that they still have those relationships with their family, those relationships with their community, those relationships with their culture. All those things that were taken away from us based off of these colonial practices that really tried to assimilate First Nations people into the dominant Western society. So I think that's a powerful thing, that placement of a child to stay within the community, to stay within family, to have that protection. We're not going to be scooping up children and putting them in a non-Indigenous house. That's the last resort. Given how big our families and communities are, I'd like to hope then that wouldn't happen. So yeah, that's one of the things that can be done right now, and I think it's a powerful thing.
I definitely agree, and I can witness the positive impacts that children carry and how fundamentally important it is for them to be around cultural settings. I see how much positivity and wellness that they carry within themselves and how confident they can be having access to these connections and that important knowledge that we carry within us as Indigenous people. I can see how important that is for reinforcing their identity, and I couldn't agree more with you. What are the current governing structure options and their effectiveness in promoting inherent rights governance?
Thank you, Nathan, for sharing that importance of identity. I totally agree with what you're saying. It's hugely important. I do appreciate this question on what the governing structures look like right now. Based off our report that we wrote together, our article, we were really curious about that. So we looked at, I believe, 11 First Nations across Canada who had signed laws with the federal and provincial governments. And we were curious to know, well, what are they governing under? Are they governing under the Indian Act? Are they governing under the Societies Act? Or are they governing under Section 35? And I think what we discovered is most of them are governed under the Indian Act and the Societies Act. So what that means is people are developing these laws and they're getting them passed and they're implementing the laws in the band office. But that doesn't make sense, because when you look at the document, the act, it doesn't mention the Indian Act or band office. It says Indigenous governing body, and that's your choice. But people are choosing to put it under the band office. And on the flip side of that, you have people creating these nonprofit organizations that are governed by Section 92 of the Constitution, which is provincial jurisdiction. And they're just creating these nonprofit organizations to implement this law. So this piece of legislation provides a tremendous opportunity to really bring back our Indigenous governing structures and practices and provide us with jurisdiction. But no one's using it. When you look at how these laws are ratified, it's usually referendum, chief and council approval, although I think we had one community where it was ratified through cultural practices, through ceremony. What really makes this an issue, though, is when you create this Bill C-92 opportunity outside of Section 35, you lose that jurisdiction. You're reinforcing these colonial structures like the band office, nonprofit organizations. Your accountability shifts from the people to the federal or provincial governments, and you fall under their legislations. So what I would really like to see is for us to create our own Indigenous governing bodies that are supported with our own laws, that are accountable to our people, that bring back our ways. Not many communities had a chief and council or board of directors before colonization. There were clan systems, there were hereditary chief systems. There was informal leadership positions where a community would recognize that someone possessed a strength in a certain area and they were empowered to do the work. We're losing those opportunities if we implement this exciting opportunity under the Indian Act or Societies Act. And I heard people say at the OCAL conference that they're afraid that we're just replicating the systems that oppressed us for a long time. That we're just going to bring back the laws that assimilated or tried to assimilate our people. And they bring their laws, and it's all written in English. And it looks word for word for how the president, the province has done things, or the federal government has done things. But what about how we used to do things? We need to remember that we have all these beautiful knowledge keepers. We've got the language. Our laws should come from our language. And our language comes from our land. It's all interconnected. So, what are the shortfalls of this? If you don't implement under Section 35, well, you're just doing things the way the colonizers have wanted you to do things. You're reinforcing what has been enforced upon us. You're losing out on this beautiful opportunity.
That is a lot of information to take in and to really appreciate, because this work is very monumental and it's been a long time coming. I can definitely respect that there is diverse progress on this going on across the country. I would really suspect, in a good way, that Indigenous governing bodies are going to have an intended very positive effectiveness and impact in promoting the inherent right governance when communities are ready to push their own laws along and implement them as part of an Indigenous governing body rather than an Indian Act Band Council. In saying that, moving forward, can you please share what are some of the diverse approaches that have been taken by different communities? And can you identify some common themes and challenges there?
So I won't touch on this one too much, given that I feel like I covered it in the last question. But I'll just kind of say that what I did find really beautiful was, when we were doing this research, the use of our language in our laws. So you look at these laws that each First Nation has implemented, and you see the language in there. And then you go to the ratification, and you see the way that some of these were ratified went outside of the typical referendum approach. It went outside chief and council approval. It talked about ceremony. And well, it didn't share too much what that ceremony looked like. That's fine, because that ceremony is personal to the community. But what I found was beautiful about that is this is an opportunity to start practicing how things used to be, in a good way, as they say. So bringing back ceremony, bringing back the people, empowering the people, bringing back our language. There's a huge tie there between language and lawmaking. I could just imagine what it's like to be an elder right now where people are wanting to understand the language a bit more. People are wanting to hear the traditional stories so we could figure out what our law principles were. It's an exciting opportunity to capture what existed before and bring it back. I think that's what really struck me the most about some of these laws, is it was an exciting opportunity to reclaim ourselves. Some of them may have been implemented and, not the best approaches if you have an inherent rights mindset. But what we have to keep in mind, too, is this term self-determination. And that means a community could decide what works best for a community. So for some of these communities, it might have made sense to say, we have this chief and council system, and we need to implement this Bill C-92. We're going to use our chief and council system as a governing structure. We're going to use this band office. Where we understand it, we're comfortable with it. And that's a community's decision. So I'm not there to judge their self-determination. What I'm here to do is say, well, there are other options too. And we should consider this when we're thinking about this opportunity. Is we could really stir things up a bit.
Those are quite amazing points, and I couldn't agree more about how important ceremony is and the way that we move things forward in our communities, from language revitalization to instilling those in our own laws. I think it's really important for us to be self-determined. So that leads me to my next question, and maybe you have answered this to some degree. Why is it important that First Nations are given the chance to control their own family services?
You're right, I probably did answer this, but it is a good opportunity to reflect. And for me, I think it's just the right thing to do. You look at the colonial history and you look at the malpractices of assimilation, disguised as children and family services. If we're going to truly talk about reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, jurisdiction's a good place to go. I mean, I say this time and time again, as First Nations people have been here since time immemorial, and our practices have sustained us for that long. We know what we're doing. We know how to take care of our children and family. It's these colonial practices, as residential schools, these 60 scoop. They provided us with a lot of trauma, intergenerational trauma that affects many generations to come. If we're going to stop this trauma, I feel like getting our jurisdiction back is one of the pathways to do so. We need to remember how we did things before. We need to bring that back. Because it worked for us. And it can work for us again. I remember Satsan, when he goes to community, he always says, we're the 7th or 8th generation born under the Indian Act. And it gets people really reflecting on that. And he talks about how we're wards of the state. Similar to prisoners or mentally incapable people. Well, I don't want to be wards of the state. I don't want to be limited by the Indian Act. I want to be proud of who I am, and I want to make sure my kids are too, and their kids are, if they choose to have kids. So yeah, that's important. We need to get our jurisdiction back, and we need to do so in a way that respects our historical practices. It's the right thing to do, and that's one of the ways that we can achieve reconciliation.
I feel like this information that you're sharing is very informative and so important for our listeners out there, for to be able to pick these uncomfortable conversations and to be willing to step in and understand how First Nations laws for child and family services are developed and how communities can be supported. I think your work is very important here, and I want to commend you for all that you do. Moving on, I have one last question for you. Why is creating an Indigenous governing body distinct from Indian Act administration important?
I think it's important for some of the reasons I listed before. It separates us from a system that was imposed on us. So the Indigenous governing body is an opportunity to bring back cultural practices or governing practices that worked in the past. So for example, for my community, we had a clan system. So a clan system would mean that every clan has a clan representative. And that clan representative would be responsible for representing its clan at clan meetings. So everyone had a voice. However, if you look at the inverse of that, let's say the Indian Act governing structure at Chief and Council, it's typically the largest family gets most of the seats because you are elected based off of how many votes you get. So if you have a bigger family, you get more seats because usually family votes for family. So you have the smaller communities, smaller clans, smaller families that do not have a seat at the table. And that's not a good way to represent and make sure that everyone's voices are heard. So if we were to look at an Indigenous governing body, how can we bring forward some of those traditional practices? How can we really lift up our people? How can we stop thinking with an Indian Act mindset, where we're limited to just what the Indian Act says when we could be so much more, and we could be accountable to our people? Under the Indian Act, there's no accountability to the people. The accountability goes to the Minister of ISK, Indigenous Services Canada. There's no mention of accountability to the people. So that's where a big issue comes from, is accountability and empowerment. And it all goes around to our people. We look at the inherent right to self-government and the workshops we facilitate in communities. We look at that people pillar. And our people have been missing. They have not been adequately informed, engaged, or empowered. And without that, there's a frustration that emerges. And there's a distrust. And sometimes out of that too comes lateral violence. So that's why I think it's important that we think about what can this Indigenous governing body look like, because it's a way to re-empower our people. It's a way to bring back our governing practices. It's a way to start thinking holistically again, to think without the shackles of the Indian Act that come with it. It's a way to be creative. It's an exciting opportunity, man. You know, when I think about this, if we have an Indigenous governing body, chances are our nations are going to need to develop their own constitution to say, what does this Indigenous governing body have the authority to do? What does it look like? How are the people going to be appointed? Who are they responsible to? And that means more community engagement. And that means we're moving towards how decision making may have been in some communities where it was consensus based, decided by the community as a whole, not to the, 3 to 12 people that sit on chief and council. It's just really exciting to think about that. But one thing that to kind of say too is when we're talking about constitutions, I think of my friend Frances Abel, Dr. Frances Abel, and she said in an earlier podcast episode, if your nation doesn't have its own constitution, the Indian Act is your nation's constitution. And I sure as heck don't want the Indian Act to be my nation's constitution. I want us to develop our own constitution to bring back how we did things.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insight. It's been a pleasure listening in on having this conversation with you today. And I'll be looking forward to hearing about more of the emerging work that you and the Center will be doing. I want to thank you and conclude that this is our time together with our special guest, and with deep gratitude. I want to thank you, Dr. Mason Ducharme, for your time and for sharing your informed voice here with us.
Thank you for your time, Nathan. You were an awesome person to work with on this journal article, and I'm hopeful that people will have an opportunity to read our article. Yeah, thank you everyone for this opportunity.
We hope you join us next time on Inherent Rights, Informed Voices, Reclaiming Our Rights and Ourselves. In the new year, our next episode will be All Things Language. Our host, MacQuarrie, will lead the conversation on how traditional languages are crucial in revitalizing self-governance laws.